Interesting developments on the West Coast, and I've been watching this one earthquake specifically. Did not want to jump on it too early. I wanted to wait for the focal mechanism because the location already made me a little bit suspicious because it is unusual. So is something brewing on the West Coast? Hashtag, of course, Cascadia fault, San Andreas fault. That is the big question now, because we see some developments that are making us look twice, to say the least. After the terrifying doublet earthquake in Venezuela, and after the strong Gulf of California earthquake in Mexico that just happened, and after the offshore quake in Oregon near Bandon that just happened, and now this strange earthquake sequence in Whidbey Island in the state of Washington, Oak Harbor. So we have to ask carefully what's going on, not because these earthquakes are proven to be connected, they are not, but because the timing is getting people's attention. And the latest one in Washington has something the red dot that we see here on the earthquake map does not show us that beach ball. And that beach ball is exactly why I waited to tell you guys, because at first it looked like maybe it's just a small local quake, right? There are local fault lines, magnitude 3.8, not huge, not destructive, not panic, although it was widely felt. That was the surprising part. People in Oak Harbor said, geez, my tail was shaking, my cups were shaking, but even further away. So it's right underneath Whidbey Island. So this is not far away from the coast. This island is actually connected to the coastline with a bridge, the Deception Pass Bridge. Absolutely beautiful island. I've been on the island many times, so I'll show you my videos in the background. Oak Harbor, basically the main town on the island in the northern Puget Sound region, and that area is not simple, right? This is not far away from Seattle and all this area, and it's crossed by mapped faults. You see the thin red lines here in the background. There's many faults, right? It sits inside one of the most complicated seismic zones in Washington. We have to say that. But that quake, another thing that makes you want to think, it was not shallow. It was 25 kilometers deep. That's 16 miles. And that's the first clue. That is really the first clue. So it's not a surface crack. This was not a landslide. This was not something you would expect to see tearing the ground open. It happened deep underneath the Puget Sound, where we do have the crustal faults. The deeper, now comes the scary name, subduction system, and the stress from the Cascadia fault, like they all start to overlap there. And of course, I am asking the question, is there, or are we next? I'm living along the Cascadia fault, where the big earthquake, magnitude 9 plus, could happen that will definitely destroy the Pacific Northwest. And we know it can trigger the San Andreas fault and vice versa. And now we know the San Andreas fault can trigger the San Jacinto fault. I hope I pronounced that right this time, guys. You're trying to teach me Jacinto fault. Now, the USGS, the beach ball diagram, we have to look at that. It's out. And my suspicion is somewhat confirmed. So it does not look like a simple little sideways rattle, this earthquake. This looks like how it's called an oblique reverse movement. And I'll get to that. Let me explain that in normal language. So a beach ball diagram that you see here is basically the fingerprint of an earthquake. It shows how the rock moved when the fault slipped. So it's not a satellite image. It's not like a crack map. It does not show the fault like a line in the ground. It shows the direction of the force. And that's what's so interesting. And by the way, the direction of the force is visible on a live video from the Venezuela earthquake. And I'm showing you footage that will blow your mind. That video's in the end screen. You have to see that. So it shows the direction of the force, where the ground was pushed, where it was pulled. and what kind of fault motion happened underground, because many things can happen together. So if the beach ball showed pure strike slip, suck, that would mean the rocks mostly slid sideways, something like the San Andreas Fault, sideways past each other, basically like two cars that are scrapping past each other. If you have two bad drivers, I mean, where I live, guys, I have to tell you, I see this almost every day. So they're scrapping past each other in opposite directions. So if it showed normal faulting, that would mean the crust was being pulled apart and one side dropped down. But this one here in Oak Harbor, it's different. So this one shows reverse or thrust style motion in the beach ball. So mixed with a sideways slip. So that's quite the cocktail. So reverse means compression. So that means the rocks were being squeezed together. So one side of the fault was being pushed up and over the other side. And now add the word oblique. Oblique means diagonal. So this was not only one block moving up, it was not only one block sliding sideways, it was both at the same time. So imagine two gigantic slabs of rock deep underground. Now push them together so hard that one wants to ride up over the other to release that pressure. But at the same time, like when this happened, drag one sideways as well. That is oblique reverse movement. Sideways plus compression. Sliding plus squeezing. And that matters a lot here because the fault systems that we do have, the red lines that you see here around Northern Whidbey Island, are exactly that kind of system. So the names to watch are, Jesus, that's difficult, the Utsalady Point, the Strawberry Point, and Devil's Mountain. Devil's Mountain sounds bad. So Island County lists all of these as notable faults that are affecting Whidbey Island and Camano Island, that is basically right next to it. The Utsalady Point fault runs through Northern Whidbey Island towards Camano Island. The Strawberry Point fault also cuts across Northern Whidbey Island, and the Devil's Mountain fault that runs along North Whidbey, basically as part of a larger fault zone. And here is really the important part. Listen to this. The USGS describes both the Utsalady Point fault and the Strawberry Point fault as oblique slip transpressional faults. That's a big phrase, I know, but it means exactly what I just explained to you. Oblique slip means the fault does not move in one clear direction. Transpressional, not transgressional, pressional means the rocks are being squeezed while also sliding sideways. So when the beach ball shows oblique reverse motion underneath Oak Harbor, the local fault suspects immediately become more interesting. So could this be the Utsalady Point fault? Possibly. Could it be the Strawberry fault? Both faults remind me of something to eat. Salad and strawberries, that's really nice. So could it be the Strawberry fault? Possibly, yeah. Could it be the broader Devil's Mountain, Strawberry Point, Utsalady deformation zone? So the whole thing? Yes, that is possible. But this is where we have to be very careful with what we think it is. I'm not saying the Utsalady fault just ruptured. I'm not saying the Strawberry fault just ruptured. And I'm also not saying this is the Cascadia fault starting its rupture. But what I'm saying is this. So the mechanism fits the style of the fault system in that area. And that is why it's not just a random dot on the map. I mean, the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network is now calling this the Oak Harbor sequence. I mean, we have several earthquakes there. That matters. They're not treating it as an isolated earthquake. So they describe a sequence with a June magnitude 2.9 event, smaller events afterwards, then a small foreshock about 1 minute before the magnitude 3.8 main shock, and several aftershocks after it. So this was Basically, we can call this a pocket of earthquakes that woke up. Again, not huge, but it woke up in a place where the fault geometry is not fully resolved. So Pacific Northwest Seismic Network says the area has known northwest-southwest trending faults, and those faults match the focal mechanisms. But because the quakes are so deep, that is the interesting part. 25 kilometers, 16 miles. Scientists cannot easily say how they connect to the faults that are mapped at the surface. And that is the key thing. The surface faults, yes, they match the orientation of that earthquake, but the depth is creating a bit of a mystery here. Do those mapped faults continue steeply all the way down to 16 miles? Do they go down that deep? So that if they rupture, it can have an earthquake with an epicenter that deep? Or is there something else down there? Is there a deeper, flatter fault underneath that is basically, how we can say it nicely, hosting these earthquakes? So, and I want to say, that's not me guessing. That is really what we call scientific uncertainty. And that's why that beach ball matters. The red dot tells us where the quake happened. The depth tells us it happened far below the surface. The sequence tells us this was not alone. But the beach ball tells us how the Earth actually moved. Under Oak Harbor, it moved with compression, deep compression, diagonal compression, sideways plus upward fault slip. But if we zoom out for a second, let's do that. This comes right after a very active stretch across the Americas. Venezuela, devastating, magnitude 7.2, and then 39 seconds later, 7.5. That happened along the Caribbean South American plate boundary. That's a completely different fault system, but it showed what can happen when one rupture loads another part of a complex fault zone. Then Mexico had a magnitude 6.0 in the Gulf of California. That is a region that is tied to the plate boundary between the Pacific plate and North America. Then offshore Oregon, west of Bandon, magnitude 5.5 at about 10 kilometers, 6 miles depth. Yes, we see earthquakes in that area, but 5.5 puts it in the higher range for that area. Officials verified, by the way, that 5.5 no tsunami threat to the west coast, but also the location there matters because it was offshore, near the broader Cascadia margin. And now we have Oak Harbor. Again, this does not mean like one earthquake caused the next. That would be absolutely way too simple, and it would not be honest if we were to say that. But it does mean the West Coast right now has multiple different seismic systems lighting up in the same news window, so to speak, right? Offshore Oregon, Gulf of California, now deep underneath the Puget Sound. That is really enough to justify the question that we ask, is the West Coast the next zone to watch? I mean, do not panic, just watch. We're watching the Pacific Ring of Fire. We've had the big megathrust earthquakes basically everywhere, just not where we are or where I am right now. And I know some of you are watching from Washington. You are there. We're just quiet, right? So are we next? Washington has more than one earthquake threat, unfortunately. People always talk about Cascadia, like the offshore megathrust that is capable of that devastating big one. But Puget Sound has also crustal faults, local faults, faults that run under populated areas. Seattle has two fault lines that can really cause Shizzy to hit the fizzy there. I've reported about that. There's lots of faults that can produce damaging shaking much closer to cities. This is highly densely populated. We have like Seattle there, we have Bellevue, Tacoma, Olympia, Everett, and all the islands, and in between everything is densely populated, right? So, and we have Mount Rainier with the Lahar threat. So that's an interesting video as well, by the way. You should subscribe and look at all these videos. So we see Whidbey Island is one of those complicated places where the map, if we look at it, does not tell the whole story. On the surface, yeah, we see all the fault names, but underground, those faults may dip, they may merge, they may split, and they may connect to deeper structures. And this is why this only magnitude 3.8 could be more interesting than it sounds. Because of where it happened, how deep it happened, right? How the fault moved. The scariest earthquakes, I have to say, are not always the ones that start like big on the map. Sometimes the important question is what the small ones reveal about the stress field that is underneath. And that's why I'm looking at this Whidbey Island thing. So if more quakes line up northwest to southeast, if depths stay clustered around 24 to 26 kilometers, 15 to 16 miles, if magnitudes were to increase or activity starts migrating towards another mapped fault zone, then this becomes a completely different level. Then it becomes much more important, right? But right now, really, the headline is not the big one started, right? If I give you an honest overview, is like a deep compressional earthquake sequence happened underneath Oak Harbor near known oblique slip faults. Focal mechanism fits the kind of stress scientists already know exists in northern Whidbey. That's why I waited for the beach ball, right? Because the map made me suspicious, the depth made it more interesting, and focal mechanism has changed that story. It's not just a small quake, it's a deep tectonic signal under one of Washington's most complicated fault zone. So what part of the West Coast is moving next? I cannot tell you guys. We know the Cascadia fault is overdue. We know the San Andreas fault is overdue. We do have the highest stress levels in over 1,000 years. And these earthquakes can happen, right? Now we see the devastation in Venezuela, and it breaks our hearts. And the force that these earthquakes can do, you have to watch this video. The Venezuela earthquake has changed the Trinidad Tobago coastline, has raised it 20 feet, all of a sudden raised the land underneath the water, basically created a new island, and it happened so fast that wildlife, stingrays, lots of crabs, they were lifted out of the water and then dry, and then they were buried between rocks and boulders. The footage is absolutely insane, and there's volcanoes involved in that. It was not just the doublet earthquakes. It's a crazy, crazy story, and when you see the images, you understand what I mean, guys. So check out this video on the end screen. It's worth it. I see you there. Bye-bye.